Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video from Gautam and I. So let's start this video with a question for you. Are you an edupreneur or are you thinking of becoming one? Perhaps you're starting out. You have an idea, something big or small, but something that you think will utterly change the world for the better. So as your imagination takes flight, you start to think, how do I bring my idea to life? How do I put together the resources to make my thoughts a reality? You also start to wonder, how do I support myself as I do this? So this video is specifically going to address these questions around this all-important topic, money and funding your company. Okay, so how can we think about money and how do we bring some structure into that problem? Gautam, you want to shed some light on that?
Sure. So here's how I tend to approach it, right? Approaching the larger question of funding your own venture can be addressed, especially in the early stages, can be addressed using these three smaller questions. Number one, when should I start thinking about funding? At what point in my entrepreneurial journey should I start thinking about it? Right? Should I start thinking about the get-go, or should I let the journey progress a little bit and think about it? Second important question is, what is my current financial status? Like, what is my exact financial scenario? How much money do I need on a monthly basis, either to support myself, my family, or my larger team or contractors? That's another big question. Third is developing a clear understanding of what are all the means available for funding. What's a realistic picture, right? We hear a lot about venture, but what other avenues are there? What is a viable avenue for me? So yeah, when should I start thinking about it? What is my current financial status? And having a good sense of all the options available out there is how I would bring some structure into that thinking. So to continue this conversation, Aruna, I think we should sort of take turns and deep dive into each of the questions that I mentioned. I wanted to hear your thoughts on what is your take on when an entrepreneur should start thinking about funding.
Okay, so we've gone over this over the past year or so, back and forth, right? I think my current understanding and the short answer to this question is, whenever you're ready to devote a good chunk of time to executing on your idea or plan or vision, that would be a good time to start thinking seriously about funding your company, right? Having said this, I want to warn our viewers that don't jump to execute too early. And let me explain what I mean by that, right? So if one thinks of the entrepreneurial journey as roughly consisting of 4 stages, I mean, there could be arguments around this, but roughly we think that there are at least 4 stages. It starts with exploration, when you're figuring out the problem statement that you want to solve. So what you're doing is you're understanding customer needs and you're doing a lot of research around this. Now, the second part is validation, when you feel like you've got into the groove and you've really figured out what problem statement it is that you want to solve. You feel like you've hit upon a good idea that can be converted to a marketable business by solving this real existing problem. And then the third stage would be traction, when you start to get popular, and scale, when you start to get really, really popular, right? So roughly what I'm saying is that once you're done with the first stage of exploring, and you're confident that you have a good idea, so you sort of hit the validation stage, roughly, then you can seriously start thinking about executing. And that's when you can seriously start thinking also about funding, how you're going to execute your project. And when we speak about funding, I want to say that we don't necessarily always mean getting external funding or asking somebody to just gift you a ton of money. What we are talking about is essentially, how will you mobilize the resources and funds that you need to cover your day-to-day tasks of bringing your idea to life. And so obviously the next step would be to have a clearer picture of how to scope out your current financial status. And I think, Gautam, you have a lot of expertise in that.
Yeah, so yeah, I've done that a lot for How to CBC and also in my previous ventures. Yeah, so it's pretty straightforward. I don't think especially early stage entrepreneurs have to spend a lot of time fighting over this. The goal is to get a very simple idea And I call this like figuring out your financial status, right? Think in terms of actual expenditure you'll incur on a periodic basis, and have a rough sense of the revenue that you'll be able to generate to cover the expenditure. So for example, I can say that project for the next, once you've decided, like you said, right? Once you've gotten to the execution stage, when you have a clear picture that you will be doing this, you will be performing this on a regular basis, you'll be spending time doing this activity, these set of activities for let's say X number of years or a few number of months. So for the sake of this exercise, I'll take 2 years as a time frame. You can actually think in terms of how much money do you need every month to live a comfortable life? That's very personal. Right? How much money will I need? Second is, how much money will you need to support your team? You'll have to pay out salaries or pay contractors. There'll be hosting charges. There'll be domain charges. So how much of cost you will incur for monthly operations, your team, infrastructure, and other expenditure. Now take a good guess of what the minimum time frame that you will have to spend before you start generating your revenue. Right. So there is a gap. You will generate revenue, you will incur expenditure, pretty straightforward. The gap, it could be if it's a very good business, you will start maybe generating profits. But early stage or entrepreneurs, you will most often see that you will have to incur losses for a little bit of time during your ramp up phase. And that gap is what you really need as funding. And that is, if you put this down on let's say a spreadsheet, you will, and this is generally called in the industry as projections. You know, whenever you're asking funding to an investor, they'll ask you to come back with projections. And I actually have made a spreadsheet for the sake of this conversation, wherein I'm actually deep diving into each of these topics. How to think about your expenditure, how to think about your revenue, how to think about your income, what the gap is going to be, and how to present that to how can you create a shitty first draft that you can possibly present to an investor. So in the next video, I will actually share my screen and actually take you through what a shitty first draft can be, and also share the link with you in the next video. So that's what I can do from my end.
Cool. So what we've talked about so far is of the 3 steps you mentioned, Gautam, we have covered when to start thinking about funding, and the second crucial question of how do you ascertain your current financial status. Of course, the details of which you will show us in the next video, where you quantify as well as organize your thoughts into a nice spreadsheet. So finally, this brings us to the last point, which is where we will deep dive into what options we have available to fund the company, and how one can go about determining which is the best option to pursue. For that, you'll have to wait for another video from us. Thank you for joining us.
Bye.
See you next time.